The most famous scene in Ghost of Tsushima is not really about a sword. It is about a rule breaking, quietly at first, then completely, under impossible pressure. A samurai rides into battle, believing that courage should be visible, that a warrior should face his enemy directly, that honor lives in the open, under the sky, where everyone can see who stood and who ran. Then, the Mongols arrive. They do not fight the way he expects. They do not wait politely for a single duel. They advance in groups. They shoot in volleys. They use shields, drums, signals, poisoned tricks in the imagination of the game, and in the real war, weapons that sounded to Japanese ears like thunder itself. The game turns that shock into the story of one fictional man, Jin Sakai, learning to become a ghost. But the real shock behind Ghost of Tsushima is not that samurai fought the Mongols. It is that the invasion may have broken the old idea of how a samurai was supposed to fight. In 1274, the most powerful empire on earth sent a fleet across the sea from Korea. Its first stop was Tsushima, a narrow island between the Korean peninsula and Japan. The defenders were not waiting inside a legend. They were waiting on beaches, in small forts, in fishing villages, with too few men and no miracle in sight. Later, Japan would remember the Mongol invasions through one overwhelming image, the divine wind, kamikaze, the storm sent by the gods. But before the wind, there was an island. Before the miracle, there were people who had to meet the empire on the sand. And before the myth, there was the sound of a bomb exploding in front of a samurai who had never heard war speak that language before. Ghost of Tsushima begins with an almost perfect historical doorway. The year is 1274. The Mongol Empire has crossed the sea. Tsushima is the first island in its path. A local samurai force rides out to meet an enemy larger, stranger, and more organized than anything Japan has faced before. That doorway is real. The man the game follows is not. Jin Sakai is fictional. Lord Shimura is fictional. Kublai Khan, the game's main villain, is fictional, though he is clearly built from the shadow of Kublai Khan, the real Mongol ruler whose orders brought the invasion toward Japan. That matters, because the game is not trying to be a documentary. It is a samurai tragedy. It takes one historical disaster and turns it into a moral question. If the enemy does not respect your code, do you keep the code and die, or do you abandon it and become something your own people may fear? The real 13th century did not frame the problem that cleanly. Medieval Japanese warriors did not live by the later, polished Bushido code that modern audiences often imagine. The word samurai itself carried layers of service, status, landholding, archery, family duty, and reward. Warriors sought recognition. They wanted their names recorded. They wanted proof of valor because proof could become land, income, and status. This is why the invasion matters beyond the battlefield. A warrior society is not only made of swords, it is made of stories men tell about why the sword matters. It is made of officials who decide which stories become rewards, families who preserve those rewards, and descendants who repeat the names. If the enemy changes the shape of battle, he also changes the shape of memory. That is one of the reasons the Mongol invasions are so revealing. They struck at the practical habits of a warrior society. A Japanese mounted archer could ride forward, announce lineage, seek a worthy opponent, loose arrows, take heads, and expect witnesses. That was not all Japanese warfare, and it was never as tidy as legend makes it. But individual display mattered. Public courage mattered. The record of who did what mattered. The Mongol-led army brought a different battlefield. It was not just Mongol cavalry transplanted onto Japanese beaches. The invasion force was mixed. Mongol officers, soldiers from conquered regions of northern China, men from the former Jin and other territories, Korean troops and sailors from Goryeo, and maritime labor forced into the machinery of empire. It was a combined imperial army, built not around the glory of one warrior, but around coordinated pressure. Drums and gongs signaled movement. Units advanced together. Archers fired in groups. Shields protected formations. Explosive weapons could scatter men and horses. Cross-cultural tactics met a local warrior system that had not been shaped by this kind of amphibious invasion. So the real story behind Ghost of Tsushima is not simply, did one samurai become a ghost? The better question is darker. What happens when an entire warrior class discovers that the enemy does not need to understand its rules in order to kill it? To understand why the fleet came, we have to leave Tsushima before the first ship appears. We have to go to the court of Kublai Khan. By the late 13th century, the Mongol world had changed from the age of Genghis Khan's open-steppe conquests into something even more complex. Kublai ruled from China. In 1271, he proclaimed the Yuan dynasty. His empire was no longer only a cavalry empire. It governed cities, fields, tax systems, ports, shipyards, and conquered peoples who knew the sea better than the Mongols did. Japan sat beyond that sea. Kublai did not begin with ships. He began with letters. That is easy to miss, because the story is remembered through beaches and storms. But before the first hull was launched, this was a diplomatic crisis. The Mongols had learned that submission could be created with ink before it had to be created with blood. A letter could do the work of an army if the receiver understood the size of the power behind it. Starting in the 1260s, envoys were sent, demanding that Japan enter a tributary relationship. The message was diplomatic in form, but threatening underneath. Kublai expected recognition. The Kamakura shogunate, the warrior government that ruled Japan in the name of the emperor, did not give it. Some envoys were ignored. Some were delayed. Japanese leaders understood enough to know the danger, but they also lived in a world where no foreign army had ever conquered the islands. The sea had always been a barrier. It was not imaginary. It was weather, distance, currents, unfamiliar coasts, and the difficulty of feeding soldiers on ships. But Kublai had something earlier conquerors did not. He had Kuria. Goryeo had resisted the Mongols for decades, suffering repeated invasions before finally becoming a vassal kingdom under Mongol pressure. That did not erase Goryeo as a state, but it placed Korean resources inside Kublai's imperial system. Shipyards, sailors, soldiers, timber, labor, coastal knowledge, all of these could now be demanded for a war that many Koreans had not chosen. This is one of the parts of the story that the word Mongol can hide. The fleet that crossed to Japan was not a simple wave of horsemen. It was an imperial machine assembled out of other people's hands. Korean shipwrights built and fitted vessels. Korean sailors rowed and steered. Soldiers from across the Yuan world were packed onto ships. Commanders had to coordinate men who did not all speak the same language, eat the same food, or fight from the same traditions. The first invasion force of 1274 is usually given as roughly 30,000 to 40,000 men, carried on hundreds of vessels. The exact number changes by source, and medieval numbers should always be treated carefully. But the scale was enormous for the waters between Korea and Japan. In the autumn of 1274, the fleet left from the southern Korean coast. Its path was obvious because geography made it obvious. Between Korea and Kyushu, there are stepping stones. First Tsushima, then Iki, then Hakata Bay, the gateway to northern Kyushu, and the administrative center at Dazaifu. The empire did not need to find Japan all at once. It could walk across the sea, island by island. Tsushima is not a stage built for legends. It is a long, mountainous island, stretched between Korea and Japan, cut by inlets and forested ridges. For centuries it lived as a frontier, trading, raiding, watching the sea, surviving between larger powers. It was Japanese, but it faced Korea. its people knew that the horizon was not empty. In 1274, that horizon filled with ships. The first landing is traditionally associated with Komoda Beach. The local commander was So-Su Kakuni, deputy military governor of Tsushima. Later tradition gives him a tiny force, often around 80 mounted men, facing an army that could not possibly be stopped by a frontier island. The exact numbers are difficult. The meaning is not. Tsushima was never going to defeat the invasion fleet. Its defenders could delay, warn, die, and become the first proof that the Empire had arrived. The game turns this into the fall of a warrior world. It imagines a charge, a crushing defeat, and one survivor who wakes into occupation. The real Tsushima did not become an open-world map waiting for liberation. It was struck, overwhelmed, and left behind as the fleet moved on. Sources describe severe violence on the island. We have to be careful with later details, because medieval war stories grow in the telling. Some of the most shocking images repeated in popular accounts come through later traditions and should not be treated as courtroom evidence. But there is no serious doubt that Tsushima suffered. Local defenders were killed, settlements were attacked, captives were taken. The island's military purpose to the invaders was clear: break the first obstacle, secure the route, and move to the next stepping stone. For an island community, even a short occupation could be a catastrophe. Storehouses could be emptied, boats could be seized, fields could be damaged, families could disappear into captivity or death. The fleet did not need to stay forever to change the island forever. For the people living there, the meaning was different. The Empire did not arrive as a theory. It arrived as smoke over houses, shouts in languages many islanders could not understand, bodies on the beach, boats pulled up under unfamiliar banners, and the knowledge that help from Kyushu would not arrive in time. This is where Ghost of Tsushima finds its emotional truth, even while inventing its characters. It understands that Tsushima was not just the prologue to a greater battle. It was a wound. A small place was asked to absorb the first impact of a world empire. And for the defenders, the shock was not only numerical, it was tactical. Japanese warriors had fought enemies before. They had killed and been killed in civil wars and local conflicts. But the Mongol-led force brought a battlefield rhythm that felt wrong. It did not revolve around one man's display. It did not pause for the kind of recognition warriors prized. It moved like a machine. A defender could ride forward, expecting the grammar of one war, and find himself inside another. That is the heart of the story. Tsushima fell not because its men lacked courage, but because courage was being measured against a system built to make individual courage insufficient. Then the fleet moved south. The next island was Iki. Iki was smaller than Tsushima, but its fate was similar. The invasion fleet struck it on the way to Kyushu. The defenders resisted. They were overwhelmed. The island became another step in the path from Korea to Hakata Bay. By the time the Mongol-led army reached Kyushu, Japan had already received warnings. News moved faster than ships when panic carried it. The Kamakura shogunate called warriors from Kyushu to defend the coast. Men gathered near Hakata Bay, a place that mattered because it opened toward Dazai-fu, the old administrative heart of the region. On November 19, 1274, the invasion force entered Hakata Bay. This was the battlefield where the cultural collision became visible. The Japanese warriors who faced the landing were not helpless. That is important. The old image of naive samurai being simply baffled by modern tactics is too simple. Japanese defenders fought hard. They rode, shot, charged, withdrew, regrouped, and inflicted real losses. The invading army did not stroll across the beach, but the invaders brought tools and methods that changed the terms. The most famous is the explosive projectile often called a thunder crash bomb. Archaeological finds from later shipwreck contexts, especially the 1281 Takashima material, confirm that explosive munitions belonged to the Mongol Yuan arsenal. The illustrated account of the Mongol invasions also preserves the famous image of a black sphere bursting near the mounted warrior Takezaki Suenaga, though the scroll tradition has a complicated transmission history and should be handled carefully. Imagine the first moment. A horse trained for arrows and shouting hears a blast like nothing in local war. Smoke erupts, fragments scatter. The animal rears. The rider loses the clean line between courage and control. The battlefield becomes sound, smoke, confusion, and group pressure. The Mongol-led army used massed archery and coordinated formations. They could punish a single warrior who rode too far forward. They could move by signal. They could make the beach feel less like a contest of champions and more like a trap for anyone who wanted to be seen. Takezaki Suenaga is one of the most important Japanese witnesses because he did something very human after the war. He wanted credit. Suenaga fought in both invasions and later commissioned the illustrated scrolls that preserve scenes from the campaigns. He did not create them only for art or memory. He needed proof of service. He had risked his life, and the warrior government rewarded men based on documented deeds. That detail is priceless. It shows us what the war meant inside the Japanese system. Valor had to be witnessed. A man could survive the Mongols and still need to fight bureaucracy afterward to prove that his survival had meaning. Suenaga's scrolls also show something else. The Japanese did not remember the invasion as a clean divine rescue, while the men who fought it were still alive. They remembered names, wounds, horses, armor, arrows, broken formations, and the desperate need to make the government see what had happened. The divine wind would become larger later. At ground level, memory was more practical. Who charged? Who fell? Who could testify? Who deserved reward? That is why the scrolls feel so alive. They are not only art, they are evidence in a warrior's argument with power. So when we talk about a samurai code breaking, we should not imagine a simple moral collapse. We should imagine a practical crisis. How do you prove individual courage in a battle where the enemy's best tactic is to deny you an individual moment? How do you win recognition when a bomb, a volley, and a formation can erase the scene before anyone sees your name? Ghost of Tsushima turns that problem inward into one man's shame. The real war turned it outward, into a government, a reward system, and a coastline suddenly forced to rethink how Japan could be defended. It made a private question into a public one. What parts of warrior identity were principles, and what parts were habits that only worked until a different enemy arrived? The first invasion did not end the way popular memory often tells it. The simple version says this: the Mongols came, the Japanese fought, a divine wind destroyed the fleet, and Japan was saved. The real ending is stranger. At Hakata Bay, the Mongol-led force won ground during the day. Japanese defenders were pushed back. Some accounts suggest the fighting reached beyond the beach, toward the approaches of Dazai-fu. The defenders had not collapsed, but the invaders had shown that they could land, coordinate, and drive inland. Then came the question every amphibious army fears: do we stay ashore overnight? The commanders were far from their base. Their ships sat in unfamiliar water. Their men had fought all day. Supplies, horses, arrows, food, local terrain, communication between units, and the danger of Japanese night attacks all mattered. Medieval sources disagree in emphasis, and historians still debate whether the withdrawal was caused mainly by weather, exhaustion, tactical caution, casualties, or the original limited aim of the operation. What we can say is this: the invasion force re-embarked. During the night, severe weather struck. Many ships were damaged or lost. The fleet withdrew toward Kuria. Thousands died at sea, though exact figures vary and should be treated with caution. Japan had survived the first invasion, but survival is not the same as victory in the clean heroic sense. Tsushima had been ravaged. Iki had been ravaged. Hakata had been breached. The enemy had demonstrated that the sea could be crossed. The barrier that had protected Japan for centuries was no longer absolute. The psychological effect on the Kamakura shogunate was enormous. If the Mongols had come once, they could come again. And next time, they might bring more ships, more soldiers, better coordination, better timing. The first invasion became not an ending, but a warning. It also created a political problem that would not go away. The defenders had fought, but much of the enemy's destruction had happened at sea. How do you reward men for a victory partly delivered by weather? How do you pay warriors when there is no conquered land to distribute? In older internal wars, victory could produce estates taken from defeated enemies. Against the Mongols, Japan survived, but survival did not create new land. It created claims, debts, resentment, and a warrior government forced to ask more of its followers while giving them less than they expected. This is where the real story becomes more interesting than the myth. Because Japan did not simply kneel and wait for another miracle. The shogunate ordered new coastal defenses. Around Hakata Bay, Japanese labor built a long stone wall, usually called the Genko Barui. It ran for many kilometers along vulnerable parts of the coast. It was not a castle wall in the fantasy sense. It was a practical answer to a practical problem. Do not let the enemy form a stable beachhead. The defenders had learned. The old way of riding out to meet the invader on open sand had nearly failed. The next defense would be less romantic. Stone, patrols, night raids, coastal watches, concentrated positions, and readiness for a second fleet. It was a quieter kind of courage, the courage of men who no longer expected the battle to look beautiful. They were preparing not for the song of one rider, but for the pressure of ships, weather, hunger, and time. This is the part the word kamikaze can erase. The storm mattered. Weather mattered deeply. But between the first invasion and the second, human beings worked. They carried stone. They organized guard duty. They argued over rewards. They prepared for a war that everyone knew might return. And across the sea, Kublai Khan prepared to make the first invasion look small. In 1281, the empire came back larger. By then, Kublai's position had changed. The southern Song had fallen. More Chinese ships and sailors were available. The second invasion was planned as a two-pronged operation. One force sailing from Korea, another from southern China. Combined numbers in the sources rise dramatically, sometimes to around 140,000 men and thousands of vessels. Again, medieval totals are debated, but the basic point is clear. This was not a raid. It was one of the largest seaborne military operations the world had seen before the modern age. The invaders again struck Tsushima and Iki. Those islands, already marked by 1274, became the first victims again. Then the fleets moved toward northern Kyushu. But this time, Hakata was different. The stone wall changed the battle. Mongol-led forces could not simply land and spread across the beach the way they had before. The defenders used the wall to deny access. The fighting shifted into raids, shipboard clashes, contested landings, and pressure along the coast. Japanese warriors adapted too. They attacked at night in small boats. They boarded enemy vessels. They harassed the fleet rather than waiting only for set-piece combat. The war at sea and shore became less like a single honorable field and more like a grinding contest of endurance. This is not the kind of transformation that happens in a single dramatic speech. It happens in small decisions. A commander chooses not to chase glory beyond the wall. A patrol waits until dark. A boat crew learns which enemy vessel sits lowest in the water. A warrior who once imagined himself as a mounted archer becomes for one night a raider climbing over a ship's side with a blade in his teeth, and no witness except the men trying to kill him. This is where Ghost of Tsushima's fictional theme echoes the real historical pressure, even if the details differ. Survival forced adaptation. Not because every warrior suddenly abandoned all ideals. Not because one secret assassin saved Japan. But because an invasion of this scale punished any society that refused to learn. Japan could not defeat the Yuan by performing an older image of itself. It had to build, watch, raid, coordinate, and endure. The invading fleet, meanwhile, suffered from its own size. Large amphibious operations are fragile. Ships need anchorage, men need food and water. Commands must pass across vessels. Different forces must arrive at the same time. Weather can turn scale into weakness. The Kudian-launched Eastern Force and the Southern Chinese Force did not operate as one perfect body. The longer the fleet remained off Kyushu, the more danger accumulated. Then, in the summer of 1281, a massive storm struck. This time, the destruction was catastrophic. Ships were smashed, shattered, driven against shores, or sunk. Many vessels were rivercraft or ships not well suited to the open sea and typhoon conditions. Men who survived the waves could be killed on shore. The invasion collapsed. Kublai would consider further attempts, but Japan was not invaded again by the Mongols. The sea had closed, and in the memory of Japan, the storm became more than weather. The word kamikaze means divine wind. In the centuries after the invasions, it became the simplest way to tell the story. Twice the Mongols came. Twice the storm saved Japan. The gods protected the islands. It is easy to understand why that story survived. It gave meaning to terror. It turned luck into destiny. It told people that the sea around Japan was not just water, but a sacred boundary watched by powers greater than any empire. For rulers, priests, warriors, and later national storytellers, that was an irresistible memory. A storm is easier to honor than a tax ledger. A miracle is easier to paint than years of coastal labor and unpaid warrior claims. There is truth inside that memory. Weather did help save Japan. The storms destroyed ships and lives on a scale no army could ignore. But the simple version hides almost everything that makes the story human. It hides Tsushima. It hides the islanders who met the empire before the mainland understood the scale of the danger. It hides Iki. It hides Korean shipwrights and sailors pulled into Kublai's war. It hides Chinese soldiers serving under Yuan command. It hides Japanese warriors trying to prove courage in a battle that made courage harder to display. It hides the men who carried stones to build the Hakata Wall after 1274. It hides the night raids, the fear, the bureaucracy of rewards, the commanders arguing over whether to stay ashore, and the terrible fact that survival often looks less like glory than adaptation. It hides the uncomfortable possibility that Japan was saved not by purity, but by change, by learning from humiliation, by replacing open sand with stone, by accepting that the enemy had made the old image of war too expensive to keep unchanged. That is why Ghost of Tsushima works as an entrance to the real history, even though it invents its hero. The game understands one emotional truth. Invasion can make an old identity feel suddenly inadequate. A man can be trained for one kind of honor and then thrown into a war where that honor no longer protects anyone. But history gives us a wider tragedy. There was no lone ghost who saved Tsushima. There was a frontier island that fell. There was no clean duel between Japan and Mongolia. There was a vast imperial system dragging Korea, China, and the steppe into the same sea. There was no single moment when the samurai code broke. There were many moments: a bomb in the air, a formation advancing, a wall built where open courage had failed, a night raid against ships, a warrior commissioning a scroll because memory itself had become a battlefield. The real story behind Ghost of Tsushima is not that one samurai learned to fight without honor. It is that Japan learned the sea was no longer enough. And when the storm finally came, it did not erase that lesson. It buried it under a myth so powerful that people still remember the wind before they remember the beach. So the next time you see Tsushima in the game, covered in grass and falling leaves, remember what the island was before it became beautiful on a screen. It was the first place the empire touched, the place where an old image of war met drums, volleys, ships, and thunder, the place where the samurai myth broke on the beach.